This is the first of two videos on Chapter 31, the respiratory system. The main function of the respiratory system is to exchange gases, and it does so in a couple of different sorts of locations. First of all, there is gas exchange between the air and the bloodstream, and so you'll see the respiratory system working with the cardiovascular system to make sure you've got gas exchange between air and the bloodstream. So oxygen in, CO2 out. The second site of gas exchange is actually going to be at the body cells, so the destination of the bloodstream. And so at this point, there's going to be gas exchange at the body cells between the bloodstream and the target tissues. And so the cardiovascular system is going to transport gases to and from the lungs and tissues and work with the respiratory system in that fashion. So you've got two major motion sort of actions for the respiratory system. There's inspiration, which is inhaling, and expiration, which is exhaling. So before we go any further, I want to sort of define a difference between two terms. One is called ventilation, and the other one is called respiration. Now, respiration is about gas exchange, and ventilation is about actually moving air. So inspiration and expiration are, I think, more properly called ventilation than they are respiration. Gas exchange with the environment in any animal is going to occur at respiratory surfaces. Now, these respiratory surfaces really do vary in structure among different animals. So with invertebrates and amphibians, gases are basically going to diffuse across the body surface. They don't really have a respiratory system per se. They carry out gas exchange over their body surface. In many arthropods, insects, crabs, lobsters, lots of crustaceans, in many arthropods, gases will diffuse between what are called tracheae and body cells without first entering the capillaries. So unlike our respiratory system, where gases first enter the circulatory system and then get transported to target tissues, here you have a lot of target tissues that lie just outside the air tubes themselves. So in this case, there's not nearly as much cooperation between the respiratory system and the circulatory systems. In fishes, amphibian larvae, and also in many other invertebrates, you can get gases exchanged with water at blood vessels that are covered by a thin layer of cells. And so basically these are going to be called gills. And so you see gills present in not just in fish, not just in amphibian larvae, but you will also see gills in a lot of invertebrates. I mentioned lobsters earlier. I probably shouldn't have done that because lobsters are going to have gills. And one of the reasons why you see marine invertebrates get so much larger than terrestrial invertebrates is for two reasons. For one thing, they don't have to support much of their body weight, but for another, they have the ability to sort of spread their gills out into the water surrounding themselves, and in that fashion, they can have more surface area for gas exchange. The last type of respiratory surface is lungs, and you find these in terrestrial vertebrates. And so basically, as we just said, blood vessels exchange gases with the air, and this happens across a thin layer of epithelium inside the body. So there are some things that all respiratory surfaces do have in common. They're usually some sort of epithelium, and they're usually really thin, and they're usually moist. Okay, well, as I said here, all respiratory surfaces have got three similarities. There's got to be a large surface area. The lungs in human beings, actually the surface area is the equivalent of half of a regulation tennis court. So if you think of somebody playing doubles at Wimbledon, if you were to take one set of lungs from one of the players and spread it out completely flat in one layer, it could cover the court from inline to net. So there's a very large surface area for respiratory surfaces. The second thing is that there's got to be some sort of contact with air or water because this is actually where the gases come from. So either you're trying to get atmospheric gas into the bloodstream, or you're trying to get dissolved gas within water into the bloodstream. So you're trying to either pick up oxygen that's present in the atmosphere, or you're trying to pick up dissolved oxygen that's in the water. The third thing that all respiratory surfaces have in common is that they're all moist. Whether you're talking about marine or freshwater or terrestrial animals, the respiratory surfaces do have to be kept moist. So some animals exchange gases across the body surface. This is basically stuff that we've already covered. Some animals exchange gases across the body surface, and others exchange gases across gills or lungs. As I mentioned before, tracheae are internal tubules, and these are present actually in the exoskeleton of insects. And these are tubules through which gases can diffuse from the atmosphere to body cells. So there are a couple of major consequences of this. First of all, I want you to take a look at the picture and see that there's not a ton of branching out from those tracheas. And so this lack of branching results in less surface area for gas exchange. And that places a real limit on the size of insects. So any sort of movies that you see in terms of insects getting larger, that is just not biologically possible. So I'm as big a fan of Marvel movies as anybody, but with Ant-Man, if you were actually able to expand an ant to the size of a dog, it would keel over pretty quickly and suffocate because it wouldn't have enough oxygen to support its cells. Okay, now another consequence is this makes insects more vulnerable to the outside environment than they might be otherwise. So if you spray an insect with Raid, it's going to keel over pretty quickly, and the reason why is because what you're doing is when you spray an insect with something poisonous, you're going to get that material, you're going to introduce that to a lot of cells immediately. So think of holding a can of Raid up to your mouth and inhaling as you sprayed it and getting it all over your lungs. I don't think that'd be something that you'd be likely to survive, and this is the reason why insects are as vulnerable as they are to insecticides. Okay, chelicerates, which include ticks, spiders, mites, and in this picture, a horseshoe crab, chelicerates have book lungs. And so basically, book lungs allow for a greater amount of gas exchange because as you can see in the diagram on the left, you've got some folding occurring with this book lung. And this is the basic reason why a lot of spiders and terrestrial crabs can get larger, in some cases considerably larger, than insects can, because they have a different mode of breathing. Most aquatic animals use gills, and these are structures that exchange gases between the animal's bloodstream and the water. So the thing that makes gills efficient is something that's called countercurrent exchange. And so the basic idea here is that blood and water flow as they go through the gills are going in opposite directions. And so if we take a closer look at the structure of gills, you can see for one thing oxygen-rich blood, oxygen-poor blood, and in purple mixed blood. And you can see that blood flow and water flow go in opposite directions. And basically what this does is as water flows against the blood flow, it is always going to encounter blood that has a lower level of oxygen, and that makes it easier for oxygen to travel from the water into the bloodstream. Likewise, as the blood flows against the water is always going to have a lesser concentration of CO2 than the blood, and what that does is all along the length of the blood vessel, it allows CO2 to leave the blood vessel. And so, again, this countercurrent system where you have blood flow and water flow opposing one another usually means that there's always a gradient down which oxygen and CO2 can move. Okay, so terrestrial vertebrates have lungs, and the description of a lung is basically a sac-like organ that exchanges gases with the atmosphere. Um, Now, as animals have grown more complex and have diversified, lungs have increased in complexity. And so you see a number of different vertebrates here, from the ancestral bony fish all the way to mammals. So a good example of lungs not being that efficient is frogs. They don't have very efficient lungs, and so they basically supplement this with what's called a pulmonary cutaneous system. And the translation of that is basically that they carry out some gas exchange through their skin. Frogs do. Um, Back about 20 or 25 years ago, there was a major epidemic amongst the world's amphibians. Basically, amphibians had their own pandemic. But instead of it being a viral pandemic, it was actually a fungal pandemic where frogs, toads, and some salamanders, but mainly frogs and toads, were actually being hit with a fungal disease in their skin that cut down on their ability to carry out gas exchange through their skin, and as a result, frogs weren't getting enough oxygen through their lungs. Okay, now terrestrial life selected for lungs rather than gills. The main reason being that two different things. Number one, that lungs are internal. This allows them to stay moist. But the second thing is there's a whole lot of folding and bubbling in lungs, and this offers a large surface area for gas exchange. And so the greater the amount of surface area, the larger the size and the higher the metabolic rate that can be supported amongst animals. Okay, so if you take a look at the difference between respiration in frogs and birds, um, you can see some differences between a less and more of a more advanced animal. So lungs are going to require animals to force air over their respiratory surface. So air isn't just going to come in and come out on its own in enough amounts to give you adequate gas exchange. You've got to have some sort of mechanism to actually force air in and out. And so with frogs, they'll do this in a pretty simplistic fashion. Um, Air enters the nostrils with the mouth closed, and basically the frog will raise the floor of its mouth. This will force air into the lungs. And how does it get air out of the lungs? It contracts the body wall to expel air. And that's the reason why when you look at a frog and you see its chin kind of moving up and down, what it's actually doing is it lowers the floor of its mouth in order to bring air into nostrils, and then it'll close the nostrils and then force that air down into the lungs. With birds, you've got a more complex system. So let's take a look at this from diagrams 1 through 4. So in diagram 1, there is a first inhalation, which is shown in blue. And so basically the air goes down the trachea and moves to the posterior air sacs. In step 2, you've got air moving to the lungs where gas exchange occurs. So you've got separate compartments for sort of the intake of air and for gas exchange. In step 3, the air that's been depleted of oxygen actually will move out to the anterior air sacs, and you're going to see inhalation number 2 in red enter the trachea. And the final step is where oxygen depleted air gets expelled as inhalation number 2 moves to the lungs. So there are some birds that can actually literally inhale and exhale simultaneously because of the system, and that's one of the reasons why songbirds can go on and on and on and on with their vocalization and not stop. Okay, as far as our respiratory system goes, lungs are the main respiratory organs for humans, and there are other organs that help the lungs function. And so a lot of our respiratory system actually involves tubes and mechanisms for getting air from outside to the lungs. And so our first point of entry, as you can see these red rectangles there, is that air enters the respiratory system through the nose and the mouth and then passes through the pharynx into the trachea or the windpipe. All right, first of all, here the nose contains 2 nasal cavities, and I know you're thinking, thanks, Captain Obvious, for the information, but it is on the slide, so I'm going to go over it. So what the nasal cavities actually do are a number of different things. First of all, it's going to heat the oxygen. Now, this says oxygen, but it would probably be more accurate to say air because it's not just oxygen that's entering. It moistens the air that enters. The nose also serves as a drain for tear ducts, but that's not really a respiratory function. So there is something that I think is pretty interesting. Um, Lining the nasal cavities, you actually see curled bones called the nasal conchae. And what these are there for is to actually increase the surface area of the mucous membranes in the nose. And the reason why is because this will allow for greater heating and greater moistening of the air as it passes through. And so one thing that's pretty interesting is that in some human populations that live either in the very far north in terms of latitude or at high altitudes, in both cases where there's a lot of cold and dry air, they'll actually have extended nasal passages with more of these mucous membranes available to moisten and heat the air as it passes through. So if any of you have ever been outside when it's really cold, at least really cold for us, 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and you take a deep breath through your mouth, it kind of hurts. And the reason why is because as that really cold, dry air gets down into your lungs, it's going to dry out the respiratory surfaces somewhat, and that's damaging to your lung tissue. So your lungs will react by sending pain signals to your central nervous system. But the next time that it's really cold outside, make sure that you breathe in through your nose, and you can exhale through your mouth just fine, but breathe in through your nose. That will make your lungs a little bit happier. So the next structure to sort of cover is the pharynx, and the pharynx is really more of a cavity than it is a structure, so I kind of misspoke there. This is a cavity that's going to receive both air and food, and you can see the extent of it in the yellow bracket that I just put on the figure. And so it's divided into basically three different sections. The nasopharynx, which is posterior or behind the nose, the oropharynx, which is behind the mouth, and the laryngopharynx, which is behind the entrance to the larynx. So moving on to the larynx is located about right here. It contains the vocal cords, and it also contains the epiglottis that prevents food from entering into the respiratory tract. Now, the epiglottis will cover the trachea when swallowing, and I think that I talked about this when I talked about this structure in your respiratory system videos. So the epiglottis is a flap that covers the trachea when you swallow. But kind of the weird thing about this is that the glottis, which is the opening itself, the epiglottis as a flap doesn't come down and cover the glottis like a trapdoor would or something like that. Basically, the epiglottis kind of stays in place, and the glottis itself gets jammed up against that. And so that's the reason why when you swallow, you see sort of a rise and a fall of the larynx. And so what I want you to do is to put your thumb and your forefinger on your larynx and go ahead and swallow right now and feel that larynx rise and then fall. So as it rises and falls, that's where the glottis is being pushed up against the epiglottis to keep food or liquid from going from the pharynx into the trachea. So this is the trachea. It's also called the windpipe. And one thing that's kind of neat about the trachea is that it has cilia that sweeps mucus back up towards the pharynx. This is something that is called the mucociliary elevator. So if you've ever been out mudding on a day when it was really warm, so you threw up a lot of dirt instead of mud, and I think you all know what mudding is, right? You get into a big sloppy truck and throw up dust and mud from a lake bed. So if you've ever been out doing that and you're out when it's dirt instead of mud, then you'll notice at the end of the day that you're going to be hacking up mud-colored snot, basically. And the reason why is because these particles of dirt, they're basically little pieces of stone. And if they get down into your respiratory surfaces, it could actually damage them. So your trachea is covered with sticky mucus, and basically the mucus traps particles, and the cells that line the trachea actually have got cilia, these little hair-like projections on them, and those will actually physically move this dirt and crud-laden mucus back up through your trachea, back into your mouth where you can spit it out. And so this is the reason why if you've been working around a lot of dust or something that's thrown a lot of particles up into the air, at the end of the day, you'll hawk it up. And so it's a good thing. It keeps it from getting to your lungs. So one more quick thing, when I was about your age, I worked in a factory over the summer to help earn money towards my college tuition. And I worked in a place where there was a lot of metal dust thrown up into the air. There were a lot of saws that were working. And at the end of the day, the stuff that I could hawk up, I could just about pick it up with a magnet. So I'm really grateful that this system actually works really well. So I will say this, though, if you put this system under an extreme amount of stress, as in coal mining or as in smoking, then this system can be completely overwhelmed and you can have significant damage to the respiratory tissue in your lungs. Okay, so as the trachea moves down towards the lungs, it branches into two bronchi, and each bronchus leads into each lung. So this says that each bronchus then branches into several smaller bronchioles. That's not quite correct. Each bronchus will branch into several smaller bronchi. So there will be two secondary bronchi for the left lung and 3 for the right lung. And those bronchi will subdivide into more bronchi. And they subdivide about 24 times, 24, 25 times. And by the time you get down to the very smallest ones, they're really microscopic. Okay, so the lungs themselves are composed of bronchi, which are right, and there's a primary bronchus right there, bronchioles, and to be honest, if we were doing this to scale, then you wouldn't be able to see the bronchioles, but I just put the arrow in there because it's a representation. And alveoli, which are represented by these little bubbles, and again, alveoli are microscopic. You're not going to be able to see them with the naked eye, and so that's just sort of a representation that's not to scale in this diagram. So with the lungs, the right lung has got 3 lobes and the left lung has got 2 lobes. So you might have recalled just a minute ago I said that there were 3 bronchi that led into the right lung and 2 bronchi that lead into the left lung. And the reason why is because there's 1 bronchus for each lobe, and after the bronchus gets in the lobe, then it subdivides. And so why would the right lung have 3 lobes and the left lung have 2 lobes? It actually has to do with the fact that your heart is more to the left than it is dead center. And so because the left lung has to accommodate the heart, it's only got 2 lobes instead of 3. Now the alveoli are where gas exchange occurs, and this occurs by diffusion. So basically diffusion is the movement of substances from an area of higher to an area of lower concentration. And so when air gets into the lungs, there's going to be more oxygen in the air than there is the deoxygenated blood that is coming to the lungs. And so oxygen will move from an area of high concentration, which is the airspace in the lungs, to an area of lower concentration, which is the blood that's passing by it. So these alveoli are sort of grape-like clusters, and they're little hollow spheres. And there is one problem that occurs with the lungs having to be moist, and that problem is actually surface tension. So you may be familiar with surface tension. If you've ever done a belly flop instead of a dive, you're very familiar with surface tension. And so this is where water molecules are attracted to one another. And the water that sort of coats the lungs, is the respiratory surfaces, is no exception. So as those water molecules are drawn towards one another, they actually have the potential to collapse alveoli. And so an analogy that I want to give you for this is soap bubbles. So when you blow soap bubbles, basically what you're doing is blowing this film of soap and water. And so you may have noticed that a lot of bubbles will burst on their own in midair without contacting anything. Basically what's happening is the water in the soap solution is being drawn towards other water molecules, and as they do that, they actually collapse the soap bubble and it pops. So with a soap bubble, the soap itself is something that is called surfactant, and what a surfactant does is to actually reduce surface tension. so soap is a great surfactant, and you may have noticed with something like bubble mixture, up to a certain point, the more soap that you put into a bubble mixture and blow bubbles with it, the longer that the bubbles last. And the reason why is because the higher the soap content in the solution, the less the surface tension. And so your lungs actually produce a type of natural surfactant, and this surfactant keeps surface tension from collapsing alveoli. So the next bullet point says that premature babies usually can't produce this surfactant, and that's true. This is the reason why a lot of premature babies have to be placed on respirators, because surfactant production doesn't happen in lungs until the very, very last part of pregnancy. So premature babies often can't produce that surfactant, and their lungs will tend to collapse because they can't breathe on their own. So once you move from bronchioles, they'll branch into what are called alveolar ducts. And so if you look at the bottom left, at that red triangle, you see the line pointing to an alveolar duct. So an alveolar duct is a really small tube that leads into several alveoli. And so you can see the cluster of alveoli on the left and then an individual alveolus on the right. And so this is basically what I meant by alveoli looking like little clusters of grapes. So one thing that I want to point out to you there is you can see that there's an extensive net of capillaries that surrounds each alveolus. And so lots of capillaries here because each capillary is bringing in deoxygenated blood. You see the blue blood vessels. In this case, blue means deoxygenated and red means oxygenated. So in this case, you have an artery carrying deoxygenated blood to the alveoli. Gas exchange gets carried out, oxygen gets diffused onto the red blood cells, and now the blood is oxygenated and it flows back out through the pulmonary veins. All right, taking a little bit of a closer look at an alveolus, again, extensive capillary net around each alveolus. I want you to notice how thin the epithelium of the alveolus actually is. So these are really thin cells that we're talking about. So I want to point out that in order for oxygen to move from the airspace into the red blood cells, so oxygen is carried on the interior of red blood cells on a molecule called hemoglobin, there are a number of surfaces that that the oxygen has to cross. So it has to cross the epithelial cells. It has to cross a membrane at the base of those epithelial cells. It has to cross the capillary walls, and then it has to cross the walls of the red blood cells. And so this is the reason why those surfaces are so thin, is because remember that the blood is constantly moving through the capillaries. And so there's a limited amount of time for the oxygen to be able to diffuse into the capillaries and a limited amount of time for the CO2 to diffuse out from the capillaries into the alveolus. And so this diffusion has to happen pretty fast. And because of that, you've got really thin walls. It's just easier to move molecules across thin walls than thicker ones. Okay, so one other thing that breathing requires is pressure changes, because air does flow from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. Always. That's basically how air moves, from high to low pressure. So as we inhale and exhale, air pressure in the lungs will actually change. So with inhalation, you're going to contract a set of muscles, mainly the diaphragm and the intercostals in the rib cage. What that's going to do is to expand the chest cavity. And when you expand the chest cavity, you actually lower the pressure within the chest cavity, and air will move towards that area of lower pressure and therefore move into the lungs. When you exhale, those muscles that have previously caused inhalation will relax, and lung tissue has a natural recoil to it, and so does the chest wall. And as those muscles relax, both the lungs and the chest wall actually collapse. This compresses the chest cavity, causing an area of higher pressure, and because air moves from higher to lower pressure, it'll move out of the lungs back out into the atmosphere. Okay, so there are a number of measures of breathing, and we're going to go over a few of those. So tidal volume is a measure of how much air passes in and out of the lungs. This is during rest, during normal quiet breathing, when you're not trying extra hard to inhale or exhale, when you're not particularly exercising much, just normal quiet breathing. This volume is tidal volume. Vital capacity is something that's completely different. This is the amount of air that can be inhaled during the deepest possible breath. So if you want to measure vital capacity, what you would do would be to take a maximum inhalation and then push out as much of a volume of air as you possibly can. So tidal volume, quiet breathing, vital capacity, maximum inhale followed by maximum exhale. There are other measures of ventilation. So inspiratory reserve volume, this is basically the idea, and this is indicated by the word reserve, that you want to be able to take in more air than just the tidal volume at need. So basically, you can force more air into your lungs by expanding your chest cavity to a greater extent than normal. So the inspiratory reserve volume is the volume that you can inhale above and beyond your tidal volume. Your expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that you can exhale above and beyond normal tidal volume, the exhalation that you have in normal tidal volume. Now, it doesn't matter how hard you exhale, there's always going to be some air left in the lungs. And this is something that's called residual volume. So there's always air that's left in the lungs. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that the air just stays there and it's completely static. When you pull air into your lungs, the air that comes in mixes with the residual volume air. And kind of the mental picture that I want you to have in your head is eddies that are caused in water by a current. So if you've got a current that's say you're going down a river and you've got a little bend in the river that leads into a little gap in the riverbank, you're going to see water move in there and there's just kind of do this real circular pattern. And so even though there's not a ton of water coming in and out of there at any given moment, still there's some circulation of the air, of the water in and out. And likewise, the residual volume, it doesn't just stay in one place. You'll see eddies form in the residual volume. So you will get some air moving, some air leaves residual volume, and some air comes into residual volume with each inhalation and each exhalation. But basically the idea here is you can't actually expel all of the air in your lungs at any time, unless you get run over by a truck or something, then that would force all the air out of your lungs.